joining us during our webinar, Taxonomy Best Practices workshop, and I hope you will get as much as possible out of this. Together with me, there are great guests, Boris and Paul. So let us start with short introduction. Boris?
Hello, good afternoon, Boris Savicki, SKS law firm, Warsaw, Poland. I'm, apart from being a co-head of the ESG practice at SKS, I'm also a member of a ESG committee at the Polish Chamber of Commerce. I'm also a member of a group supporting EFRAG in the development of voluntary reporting standards for SMEs, and also a member of a group working on the taxonomy at the Polish Ministry of Development and Infrastructure.
Thank you. Paul?
Hi, my name is Paul Gilbert. I'm from the UK, from London originally. Now I work in Tel Aviv, and I'm the compliance officer at Findings.
Thank you very much. And my name is Noemi Malska. I'm a General Manager for Europe at Findings. And today I will moderate our webinar. So let me start with a short introduction about the concept of taxonomy. In general, it all started from the Paris Agreement, the Green Deal, saying that EU shall become carbon neutral by 2050. And that the growth of temperature will be no more than 2 degrees. And in order to achieve that, some regulations have been implemented, and taxonomy is such an example. Taxonomy is a guidance map that, together with the shift of money flow from brown to green investments, are aiming to fulfill before mentioned Green Deal. Taxonomy is the worldwide idea. It has already been developed in Europe, but currently there are 30 taxonomies under construction around the globe. They are all based on scientific research, and hopefully other international taxonomies will be mostly based on the EU document, which will make all of us life a bit easier. And at the end of the day, we all have the same goals, so the way to achieve them will be similar. So in European Union, the taxonomy framework is used by countries, by municipalities, by EU grants providers, by financing providers such as banks and investment funds, and ending with, of course, each single company that at the end of the day needs to be aligned with taxonomy. So the universality of taxonomy is crucial here. So the taxonomy assessment is slightly different than other assessments that we can hear about from the ESG space, because it's more like a roadmap showing which path companies should take. As well, it sets higher standards than the national regulation, and thus today just a few businesses, if any, are aligned with taxonomy. Of course, the plan is to expand it. To cut the long story short, companies may point which of their products, actions are aligned with taxonomy, and based on that, the funds providers can make investment decisions more sustainable and thus fulfilling the Green Deal. So, Boris, you're a lawyer working with taxonomy on a daily basis. So, can you please point and share with us some few key requirements and obligations for companies under taxonomy regulation?
Thank you, Naomi, for this introduction. As you have pointed out, taxonomy is a roadmap. It's a roadmap for transition to green, on neutral, inclusive economy. So we have the goal, as you have correctly pointed out. That is the goal set out, among others, in the Paris Agreement. and we have very little time to achieve that goal. According to scientists, we have time to significantly decrease greenhouse gases emissions by 2030 if we want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Thus, any action we take must be fruitful, so to say. So it must bring effects, real effects. We can any longer say, well, we have switched from plastic bottles to green bottles. It is, of course, necessary, a good action, a right direction, but changing the bottles from which we drink, or undertaking or planting some trees behind or in front of the factory will not allow us to get where we are supposed to get. For that, we need real actions based on scientific knowledge, scientific evidence. And we know quite well what to do in order to limit greenhouse gases emission, in order to counteract climate changes, to mitigate, as the taxonomy says, to mitigate the changes to the climate. We, of course, know the climate will change, so we have to adapt. That is another goal set out in the taxonomy. The question is, does each business have to comply with the taxonomy? The good news is not. But that's also a bad news in the sense that if you do not comply with the taxonomy, in a few years' time, it may be difficult for you to get financing from bank or from an investment fund. It may be difficult to find an investor. It may be difficult to sell your products because the banks, investment funds, or even your business partners will need to report certain elements, will need to report on the composition of their value chain. And if you are in that value chain, it's better that you can provide that you are aligned with taxonomy. So what does it mean to be aligned with the taxonomy? It means that your business activity makes important contribution to one of 6 goals set out by the taxonomy. These goals are, apart from those 2 which I mentioned, that is climate mitigation and climate adaptation, also circular economy, preservation of water and marine resources, biodiversity and reconstruction of ecosystems. These are the goals set out by the taxonomy, which the business the activity has to make substantial contribution to. But it also cannot, even if it makes a substantial contribution to one of those goals, the activity cannot do any significant harm to other goals. So on one hand, you have to make substantial contribution to one of the goals. Then on the other hand, you cannot make any significant harm to other goals. How determine whether or not an activity is making substantial contribution to one of the goals? For that, there are delegated acts to the taxonomy. One, the climate delegated act, which has already been issued. The other, environmental delegated act, on which works are still being conducted, but we are expecting to see the final document still this year. And based on those 2 documents, you can assess whether an activity is taxonomy aligned. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning, a sustainable activity is also an activity which is inclusive. It means takes into account the human factor. So an activity which is sustainable has to take into account the so-called minimum guidelines, which are set out in the OECD guidelines for enterprises, for multinationals. and the UN guidelines for business and human rights. Once you have fulfilled all those criteria, then you can say my business activity is taxonomy aligned. It's green.
Thank you. So it seems like not only this one in general, since we are all working in a compliance space, we know that regulations are difficult and taxonomy is not a simple one, no doubts about that. So naturally, companies, especially that it's a new regulation at the market, they are facing some difficulties in complying with taxonomy. To name just a few, I would say that we have data availability, both internally from the company as well from the whole supply chain, because we haven't mentioned yet that regulation, when it touches a particular organization, it may require self assessment, but as well checking the whole supply chain. Here comes the question and concern that the needed data might be firstly difficult to allocate, but as well they still might be need to determine. On the other hand, we have continuous monitoring because the whole compliance space is shifting from one-time snapshot showing the company's situation in particular moment into continuous monitoring, which means it requires from companies to continuously aggregating, collecting, analyzing, reporting data to be sure that the company is aligned with taxonomy criteria. And the third one I can point here is from the investment providers' perspective, because we have two, at least the most important part of the coin. On the one hand, there are companies that need to be aligned with taxonomy. On the other hand, there are financial providers such as banks and investment funds. And when they are making sustainable investment decision, they need to ask their potential investments to show them reports proving that they are aligned with taxonomy. So understanding the data, it's none of their core business, neither for companies nor for investment providers. So suddenly they need to learn the whole new topic and as well get somehow exposure to a massive amount of data from all of their hundreds or thousands of investment. So Paul, you're exposed to working with businesses on a daily basis, so you're exposed to some of their pain points. So can you please point from your perspective what might be difficulties that companies are facing in this process?
Sure. The first issue, I would say, is interpretation issues. Under Article 8 of Taxonomy, companies have to state what their capital expenditures are and their operating expenditures. But what is the difference between an investment and capital expenditure? Similarly, what is the difference between a business expense and operating or operational expenditures? This is unclear. This causes confusion. And to give you some examples of what I mean, is installing a solar panel for an economic activity an operating expense? Is it a business expense? Is it a capital expenditure? Who knows? And similarly, if you're doing maintenance work for a machine that is for the manufacture of cement, what does that come under? Again, it's not clear yet, and this will cause confusion. Any confusion could mean that companies misrepresent their data in their reports, and misrepresentation of data can mean that by sheer accident, companies don't adhere to the taxonomy regulation, which, as Nomi and Boris have already alluded to, that has consequences. So that's one issue that I've come across when dealing with companies trying to implement and adhere to the taxonomy regulation. Another one is that taxonomy is not internationally consistent yet. The EU's taxonomy regulation is the benchmark, in my opinion. It is brilliant, it is exhaustive, in my opinion, and as it happens, other countries like Singapore have based their taxonomy regulation on the EU's. But not every country, if it has a taxonomy regulation, for example, the US does not have a taxonomy regulation. Other countries have not based their taxonomy regulation on the EU's. They have different criteria for economic activities, which will cause problems because, well, first, it undermines green efforts to be sustainable across the globe. And two, companies may decide that they will adhere to the criteria in other jurisdictions, which potentially are less onerous, less rigorous than in the EU itself. And again, there are consequences for that. The last challenge that companies, in my opinion, face is the sheer cost of trying to comply with taxonomy. Now, for a large company with a great deal of money and people for resources, that isn't such a problem. They can get the data that Nomi has spoken about. They can make sure it's accurate, etc. But for small and medium-sized companies, for SMEs, that's not necessarily the case. It can cost a lot of money, and they may not have the resources, the expertise to be able to do that. As a result, they may have to rely on incomplete and poor quality data. And when they do come to finalizing their reports, well, that could mean they get a bad ESG score. It could mean that they don't get the investment that has already been spoken about, and they can't partner with other companies either. They'll become something of a pariah, which is not good. And the net effect for that for the EU could be that these companies don't offer their goods and services to the EU market, which would be detrimental for the EU, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. So, as always, the giants will survive, but a bit smaller entities, and mostly we have SMEs acting at the market, they might be hit seriously by the need of fulfilling the regulation. So compliance space, and the whole risk, like each other business processes, are having some technology possibility of using in order to ease these processes, in order to help these employees that are acting within the space to somehow overcome mentioned challenges like data collection, like analysis, maybe trying not to grow their costs. So can you please tell us what might be the real benefits for companies of the product that the findings is developing, and what's the real value that the product can actually bring to mostly SMBs?
This is a great question, Nomi. Thank you for asking me. The compliance platform that we have, it's called findings.co, which you can find online. It is absolutely brilliant for automating the compliance process. First reason, you don't need to send emails out anymore. In the old days, in times gone by, a member of an enterprise would have to send out an email to every single member of their supply chain with the assessment, with spreadsheets, and on top of that, they would need to have another spreadsheet to keep track of who they have and who they have not sent out the assessment to, and also where the assessee is up to in the assessment. On our platform at Findings, you don't need to do any of that. All you need to do is assign the assessment to every member of the vendor efficiently. It saves time, it saves a lot of effort and energy. It's brilliant in that respect. And the platform will also send out emails to the relevant members of the supply chain, whether it is urging them to start the assessment or it's to continue the assessment. And on top of that, the platform automatically keeps up with the progress of each assessee, so you don't have to. So that's the first reason. The second reason why Findings is a great platform is because if a vendor has a question, they can use the platform to ask the question in two ways. The first way is our newly integrated AI feature, which enables a vendor to ask the question to the AI feature. The AI feature can advise them on how to answer the question. And then it goes even one better, actually. It can enhance an answer as well. which I think really, really benefits the vendor. It makes the process so much faster. And the other way that a vendor can ask a question is through our platform directly to the enterprise, by which I mean they can use our chat feature. On this, once the vendor has typed in their question, sent it, the enterprise gets a notification, and by clicking that notification, the enterprise will be taken to the control of the question and can answer it directly. Much more simple than in the past, when the vendor would have to go through emails, would have to email the enterprise, and quite honestly, in the past, the question would get lost somewhere in the enterprise's inbox. This doesn't happen anymore. Again, it saves time, money, and it is so much more efficient. And the last reason why the findings platform is beneficial for companies in a customer-supplier relationship, the system automatically collects the score, calculates it at the end. So what I mean by this is that once the vendor has finished the assessment, once they finalized it, the enterprise has reviewed it, the system automatically then will calculate the score, again, saving the enterprise time. The way the system goes one better, though, is because after they've done that, for every question the vendor gets wrong, whether they have passed or failed the assessment, a finding will appear, hence the name of the company. With this finding, we provide a description of the problem and a recommendation for how the vendor can put right the problem they have. This is brilliant because they can fix their systems. It creates better system hygiene for all members of the supply chain, and thus it is a win-win for all parties, the enterprise, the vendor, and the whole supply chain by using the findings platform.
Great. We all hope that each business at some point will use the platform. Nonetheless, not each business is or will be in the near future obliged to do it. And Boris, if you can please elaborate a bit on the topic of identifying relevant activities and the sectors that are covered by the EU taxonomy, so our guests can no more be guessing whether they are actually under the regulation or not.
Sure. Thank you. The taxonomy currently covers around 80 sectors or 80 sectors of business activities, which is around 93% of greenhouse gas emissions in the EU. You may ask, okay, so it does not cover all activities? The answer is yes, it does not cover all activities, and it will not cover all activities, because there are two reasons for that. Firstly, there are activities which will never be green, and some of them are expressly indicated in the taxonomy, that is energy production from fossil fuels. This will never be an activity that will be taxonomy aligned. But there are activities which are irrelevant from the perspective of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. Like, for example, lawyer's work, or an artist's work, or a teacher's work. There is no need to spend time and resources on measuring such an activity, because we have other activities on which we should focus, which still have some homework to do. This is transportation, energy production, also real estate sector, building construction, which is itself both in terms of production of concrete, for example, but as well as during the operational phase when the buildings are just using the energy, the energy consumption, the greenhouse gas emissions in the real estate sector is quite significant. Then we also have waste management, transport. So there are as I said, around 80 sectors which are covered by the taxonomy. The number with the introduction of the environmental delegated act, that is the act which will cover the remaining four goals set out in the taxonomy, expected this year. Then the number will increase up to 100, and some 90% of greenhouse gas emissions, because at that time it will not only cover gas emissions but also other factors. So there is a significant portion of the economy covered by the EU taxonomy. But the taxonomy is designed as a dynamic. It is going to be reviewed by the European Commission every 3 years. Some activities will be added depending on the developments in the technology. Certainly, new business activities may come into play. So that is something which will definitely be changing its shape from time to time. It is important to know. I'm much more optimistic than Paul appears to be. A taxonomy, despite certain controversies, is a really useful tool that will assist businesses in their transformation. Because one may ask a question, okay, I'm covered. My business is, for example, in the waste management or real estate. So I'm covered by the taxonomy. Then do a test to see whether the activity is aligned with the taxonomy or not. And if it proves that the activity is not aligned with the taxonomy, this, I would say, excellent tool, taxonomy, does not leave that entrepreneur without care, without future, does not require it to close him or her, to close business activity. It says, if you are not aligned with the taxonomy today, you can draw up an investment plan that would show the way, the investments, those CapEx and OpEx investments, which Paul mentioned, which you will make and which allow you to transform into a taxonomy aligned activity. You may have 5 years to do that. The period may be extended up to 7 years. So even if today you are not taxonomy aligned, there is nothing to worry about. There are ways, there are instruments within the taxonomy that will allow you to transform your business. And certain banks already recognize this type of efforts and say, okay, if you come up to us with an investment plan showing CapEx and OpEx expenditures which are taxonomy aligned, we will not only give you financing to cover those costs, but we will also give you a lower interest rate on those expenses, because we want to have such clients in our portfolio, because we banks will also have to report, we investment firms will also have to report whom we provide financing. So it's an excellent tool that will help, hopefully, and despite the concerns that Paul mentioned, help transform the economy. So even if you are not today, you do not feel the pressure to use the taxonomy to transform your business, it's good to start thinking of that. It's good to see whether you are covered by a taxonomy, and if yes, what is the regulatory gap? How much you have to, whether you are aligned already, that would be fantastic. But if you're not, to see how much you would have to do in order to be aligned. And if you don't feel pressure at this time, at least start thinking of that. Thank you.
Is there any other requirement for companies, because you distinguish the different sectors that are under taxonomy regulation, and I wonder if like with other frameworks within the overall ESG space, is there any requirement regarding amount of employees or yearly turnover, that particular companies are for sure obliged to align with taxonomy or not. Because it might be that even a small company, an SME, that may read that among the whole ESG regulation, they have less than X amount of employees, they have less than Y yearly turnover, so they think that they are not a part of this space. But then, when they are applying for investment loan to a bank, suddenly they come up with this situation. So is this like that, or there are some strict regulations that particular companies, despite sectors, for sure will not be under taxonomy?
I think it's good to stress two things here. First, generally, taxonomy is a benchmark which sets forth the requirements for the future. So it's a target, it's a goal we should achieve. So in this sense, it is not mandatory. So when you start an investment, you do not have to meet the requirements set out in the taxonomy. If you are running your business, you do not have to meet the requirements set out in the taxonomy. But as I mentioned before, you may be required, and you mentioned, Noemi, you may be required by your bank or by your business partner, who will have to report whether, for example, the bank will have to report whether the money provided to a business is provided to a green business, to a taxonomy aligned business, to a sustainable business. That's one thing. The other, your business partner may need to report his expenditures, fiscal expenditures, to see, okay, that much of my expenditures are related to a taxonomy aligned activity. So that is this non-involuntary part of the taxonomy. Then there is an obligation, of course, for those who are subject to non-financial reporting under the NFRD directive, which currently applies to so-called public interest entities that employ more than 500 employees. But with the entry of the CSRD directive and reporting under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, the scope of reporting, which we will now be called not non-financial reporting, but sustainability reporting, will vastly expand. Apart from those public interest entities, all large companies in the EU will have to start reporting starting from the financial year 2025. And then next year, all small and medium enterprises that are listed on a regulated stock exchange will also have to report. So it may, and all these entities will have to report the turnover, capex and opex under the taxonomy. And in order to do that, they will have to check whether they are taxonomy aligned or not. And it may happen, therefore, that your business contracts will need to report, and as I said in the beginning, will ask you to report. So we may expect that despite the taxonomy being in vast part a voluntary act, which does not obligate anyone to comply with it, that its requirements will soon become a bread and butter of the business, because everyone will want to see whether her business partners are taxonomy aligned, whether the investments they are making are taxonomy aligned. For example, I can hardly imagine an investor who is now considering an acquisition in an M&A transaction not to consider whether the target is taxonomy aligned. As I said at the beginning, it does not have to be taxonomy aligned. Even it is unlikely that the target will be today taxonomy aligned, but at least the target should have some considerations, some thoughts about where it is, what has to be done in order to be taxonomy aligned. Because for that investor, it will mean that a non-taxonomy aligned entity will not be possible to sell it in a few years' time.
Sure. And even if it's not mandatory for a particular company, it still might be very tempting to get more in depth into the topic due to, as you mentioned, lower interest rates offered by the banks who are by themselves reporting to regulators, who by themselves are interested in creating their investment portfolio greener, more sustainable. So even if a particular company or their board are not, like I am, engaged in the topic and changing the company to the greener one, they still may actually provide real changes only because of the financial encouragement, the financial plus offered by the bank. And I think it's still fine. Whatever works, it works for all of us because we are living here and we want businesses acting in a proper manner. We have some questions from the audience. So let me read the question and let's see who is taking that one. So the first question is regarding potential emerging sectors or activities that are expected to be included in the EU taxonomy in the near future. So you mentioned, Boris, the current sector that are relevant, but here the question is about some new emerging sector or activities.
It's not clear yet, but there is there are works on, of course, continuous works on expansion of the taxonomy. The technical experts group at the platform for sustainable development is working on them. There are the main goal was first to deliver the climate delegated act and the environmental delegated act, which I mentioned, covering four additional goals of the taxonomy. And going forward, you may expect that other activities which are within the sectors that are either GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, strong greenhouse gas emitters, or which are affecting environment to a significant degree, will be added. And of course, at the same time, because we as people, we do not like to, we prefer black and white. So we want to see, we would prefer, and that is the signals that came from the market on the reception of the taxonomy and giving lectures. I also hear them from my listeners, from students. They say, okay, so we have taxonomy which covers green activities, but then there is this rest of activities, and there are works contemplated on the so-called extended taxonomy, which will cover the green activities, the gray area. So, for example, the lawyer's work, or the accountant's work, or the artist's work will also be included in the taxonomy, but just to say these are neutral activities, but they are fine to run them. And maybe they will be a red part of the taxonomy, which will say these are activities which are so harmful to the environment, to the climate, that they should be dismantled and discontinued. And of course, in order to do that, you also need financial resources. You need to do something with the people. So it is going to be an issue which has to be somehow addressed, financed, and so on. So definitely taxonomy will be developed in various directions, but at this moment, I think it would be premature to speculate on what should be, what businesses should be added next.
Sure, thank you. Second question, I think we actually already answered. It's whether taxonomy becomes legally binding in the future or it will be left as a recommendation.
So maybe I will sum it up in a few
Sure.
words. Taxonomy is mandatory for all those entities which are subject to currently non-financial reporting. At this moment, it is a limited number of largest companies in the EU, listed companies employing over 500 employees, banks, insurance companies. With the entry into force and application of the CSRD and ESRS, this will expand onto for all large businesses and then listed SMEs. And for all those entities which are obligated to report, they will also need to report on the three KPIs which we mentioned, that is turnover, CapEx and OpEx. And in order to do that, they will need to do a test whether their activity is taxonomy aligned or not.
Thank you. We've got another question. Are there specific mistakes or pitfalls that companies frequently encounter during the reporting process, and how can they be avoided? Paul, I think you can say a few words about it. You can start.
I can indeed. Aside from all that we've already said, Nomi and I, one of the things I have noticed, a mistake, a pitfall that companies face reporting, particularly about greenhouse gases, is making sure that their reports are accurate and also the breakdown of their greenhouse gases are accurate as well, which is a lot harder to do than I think most companies realize at first. Why I say this is because when we say greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions, that is primarily consisting of three gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. Carbon dioxide is the one that, generally speaking, is the accurate one. But what about the methane, and what about the nitrous oxide? This has often left companies to estimate or guess based on other companies or just general guidelines. So those are generally the way that you can avoid the problem.
Yeah, I would, if I may I, based on our works at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Development Group for the implementation of the taxonomy, one of the key, so to say, pitfalls of the taxonomy we have identified is sometimes the difficulty in understanding by businesses of the technical screening criteria. The technical screening criteria are those criteria set out in the delegated acts, which allow you to say whether an activity is taxonomy aligned, whether it makes a material contribution to one of the goals set out in the taxonomy, and on the other hand, whether it does not significantly harm the other goals. And despite these criteria being very technical, it turns out that, and despite they have been developed by a group of experts, 200 or more than 250 experts have been working on the criteria, it turns out that they are not, that sometimes there are controversies as to how they should be interpreted, how they should be implemented. And I think that might be one of when the taxonomy is more often used and starts to be used, that is going to be one of the key difficulties in using the taxonomy. And what advice I would have for the businesses when making a judgment, because once you have to make a decision whether you qualify this factor this way or another. If you are not sure, reach out for an external consultant who will provide you with the opinion. If an unqualified opinion cannot be issued because the issue is unclear, explain the position you have taken. Explain why you believe that is the way you have chosen to move forward with, why you have made such a decision. And with this, then you will be in a position to explain your position as you are audited once a bank reviews your statement on the taxonomy or an investor and asks why you decided that your activity is taxonomy aligned, you will be in a position to say, that was my decision, that was my way of thinking. I have collected opinions, or at least one opinion from an expert, and based on that, I made my judgment. And I think so there are pitfalls. It is a new act. It hasn't been very much tested thus far. So everyone is learning, and that is another thing we should remember. Everyone, including the EU bodies, are learning. There are still a lot of questions, and there will be questions. So do not be aware to ask a question, and if the question is answered in an unambiguous way, then explain your position.
Great, thank you. We have to wrap it up. Thank you, first of all, to the audience for participating and your engagement. Thank you, Boris and Paul, for sharing your knowledge and perspective. If somebody has some additional questions, you can always reach to us. Boris, as a lawyer specializing in overall ESG space, including taxonomy, Paul and myself as well. We hope that if you have any questions, you can always reach out to lawyers for getting the strategic advice and consultancy, and to us as representatives of innovative technology that, after getting the professional expertise, will help you to actually fulfill the requirements. So thank you very much for your time. I hope we'll meet again soon regarding new regulation, and wish you all a great afternoon. Bye-bye.